I was accused of being a thief by my son's biological father's fiancée because she wanted to remove my son and me from the high-class party. Chapter 1. The crystal chandelier lights of the Plaza Hotel could not hide the darkness in Sophia Vance's eyes. As she looked at us with pure contempt, I was holding a silver tray of champagne, trying to stay invisible behind the velvet curtains. But my 5-year-old son, Leo, had wandered near the dessert table. Sophia, the woman engaged to Leo's biological father, marched over to him. She did not scream. She simply tipped her glass of red wine onto Leo's cheap gray hoodie, watching the liquid stain the fabric. Then she gasped loudly, accusing my son of stealing a guest's watch to cause a scene that would justify throwing us out. The guests turned their heads, their eyes filled with judgment. While I rushed forward to protect Leo, I dropped my tray, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the silent hall, and pulled Leo behind me. Sophia smirked, pointing a manicured finger at my face, and declared that trash like us did not belong in a place of such elegance. She called for security, claiming that my son was a pickpocket who had snuck in to steal from the elite. Ethan Sterling approached the commotion, his presence dominating the room like a cold shadow that swallowed all warmth. He did not ask what happened, nor did he look at me with any recognition. He simply looked at Leo's stained clothes with absolute disgust. To him, we were not humans with feelings. We were merely errors in his perfect evening, liabilities that needed to be liquidated immediately. He demanded security to remove the gutter rats from his sight before the press arrived. Sophia added fuel to the fire, claiming the missing Patek Philippe watch was in Leo's pocket, and insisted we be searched right there. I wanted to scream that Leo was his son, that the blood running through the boy's veins was the same as his, but I swallowed the words like broken glass. If Ethan knew the truth, his army of lawyers would crush me and take Leo away within an hour. I had $70 in my bank account. While he made $70,000 a minute, I could not fight him. The head of security grabbed my arm, his grip painful and tight, while another guard seized Leo's small shoulder. Ethan looked at his watch, bored by our suffering, and ordered us to be searched publicly to ensure we took nothing of value. The search was a spectacle for the wealthy guests who sipped their drinks and watched us like animals in a zoo. They patted down my uniform and roughly checked Leo's pockets, finding nothing but a toy calculator. Sophia, unwilling to lose face, sneered that we must have swallowed the jewelry or hidden it elsewhere in the room. She demanded I kneel and clean the wine from the floor to prove my remorse, or she would press charges for trespassing and attempted theft. The threat of a criminal record, which would ruin my chance to keep Leo and give Ethan the perfect excuse to claim custody if he ever found out, forced my knees to bend. I knelt on the cold marble floor, using my apron to wipe the red stain that looked like blood under the yellow lights. The humiliation burned my skin, but I kept my head down, biting my lip until I tasted iron. Ethan Sterling watched with indifferent eyes, tossing a $100 bill at me as if paying for a cheap show. He told me to take the money and buy better clothes for my child so he would not look like a beggar on the streets of New York. He turned his back on us, taking Sophia's arm, and walked away without a second glance. The security guards hauled us up and dragged us toward the exit, throwing us out into the freezing winter night. The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off the warmth and the music, leaving us in the silence of the falling snow. We sat on a park bench across the street while the snow began to coat Leo's stained hoodie. I tried to wipe the wine off his cheek, tears freezing on my own face. But Leo did not cry. He just stared at the glowing building where his father was celebrating. Leo pulled out his cracked tablet from his waistband, his small fingers moving across the screen with terrifying speed. He looked at me, his face void of childish emotion, and said that the countdown had begun. He had not stolen a watch. But while the security guard held him, he had memorized the RFID code of Ethan's black card that fell slightly from the man's pocket. Leo tapped the screen one last time, his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the code. He whispered that the game was no longer about survival, it was about destruction. The sound of a heavy fist pounding against the peeling paint of our apartment door echoed through the small room, making the stagnant air feel even more suffocating. I flinched, instinctively pulling Leo closer to my side, as the aggressive voice of Mr. Russo, our landlord, boomed from the hallway. He shouted that he knew we were inside, and he demanded we open up immediately, or he would call the police to throw our belongings onto the street. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, unlocking the door to reveal Mr. Russo's red and angry face, his eyes scanning the room with disgust. He did not wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, his heavy boots leaving wet marks on the floor, and declared that our time was up. He held a crumpled eviction notice in his hand, waving it in my face, and stated that he had found a new tenant who could actually pay the rent on time. I tried to speak, my voice shaking, telling him that I needed just a few more days, but he cut me off with a harsh laugh. He looked at the $100 bill I was still clutching, the money of shame from Ethan, and sneered that $100 would not even cover the late fees. He told me that in New York, money talks, and silence is for the poor who cannot afford a roof over their heads. He leaned in close, the smell of stale tobacco on his breath, and whispered that if I did not have $2,000 by tomorrow morning, he would call Child Protective Services. He would tell them that I was an unfit mother living in squalor, ensuring that Leo would be taken away into the foster system before the sun went down. The threat of losing Leo hit me harder than any physical blow, stopping my heart for a terrified second. Mr. Russo turned and walked out, slamming the door with enough force to make the walls shake, leaving me paralyzed in the center of the room. I sank to the floor, the cold linoleum biting into my skin, and buried my face in my hands, feeling the weight of the world crushing my spine. I had no one to call, no assets to sell, and the only man who could help me was the one who had just thrown me out like garbage. Leo walked over to me, his small hand resting on my shoulder, his touch light but steady. He did not cry. He did not look afraid. He simply walked to the corner where his old laptop sat on a stack of books. He sat down, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen, and cracked his knuckles like a seasoned pianist preparing for a concerto. He looked at me with those intense, intelligent eyes and said that I should not worry about the rent, because the rent was a small problem compared to what he was about to do. He told me that Ethan Sterling had humiliated us for $100, so he would take 1,000,000 times that amount from him. Leo's fingers began to fly across the keyboard, moving so fast they blurred, entering lines of code that looked like a foreign language. He was not just playing a game, he was accessing the back end of the Sterling Capital high-frequency trading server. Ethan Sterling sat in the back of his limousine, sipping a glass of aged whiskey, feeling the satisfaction of a successful evening despite the earlier interruption. He scrolled through his phone, checking the Asian market opening numbers, expecting to see his wealth growing as it always did. Suddenly, his phone screen flickered, the numbers on his portfolio dashboard freezing for a split second before turning a violent shade of red. He frowned, tapping the screen, thinking it was a connection error. But then his main line began to ring. It was his chief financial officer, a man who never called past midnight unless the building was on fire. Ethan answered, his voice calm and cold, asking what the problem was. The CFO was hyperventilating on the other end, his words tumbling out in a panic, screaming that the algorithm had gone rogue. He reported that someone had bypassed the firewall using a master override code, a code that only Ethan possessed, and had initiated a massive sell order on their biggest real estate project. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles turned white. He yelled at the driver to pull over, his mind racing to understand how this was possible. The CFO continued, his voice breaking, stating that the system was dumping shares of the Skyline project at 0.1% of their value. Every second that passed was costing the company millions of dollars, and the fail-safe protocols were not responding. Leo sat in the dark apartment, his eyes reflecting the cascading streams of data, his expression completely devoid of mercy. He saw the panic in the server's response, the digital franticness of the Sterling engineers trying to plug the hole he had created. He did not steal the money for himself. He simply opened the floodgates and let the value evaporate into the digital void, burning Ethan's legacy to the ground. He muttered to himself that this was the price of arrogance, his finger hovering over the enter key to execute the final command. I watched him from the floor, a mixture of awe and terror filling my chest, realizing that my 5-year-old son was waging a war against one of the most powerful men in the city. Leo pressed the key, and on the screen, a progress bar filled up instantly, confirming the transaction was complete. He turned to me, a small, cold smile playing on his lips, and said that Ethan Sterling had just lost $100 million in 4 minutes. He then opened a second window, navigating to the landlord's bank portal. He explained that while he was inside the banking network, he had rerouted a microscopic fraction of the lost funds, a rounding error that no one would notice in the chaos. He transferred 12 months of rent directly into Mr. Russo's account, marking it as an anonymous direct deposit. Leo closed the laptop, the silence returning to the room. But the air felt different now, charged with a dangerous electricity. Back in the limousine, Ethan Sterling stared at his tablet in disbelief as the notification flashed across the screen, confirming the catastrophic loss. $100 million of liquidity had vanished, wiped out by a ghost in the machine. He slammed his fist against the leather seat, a roar of pure rage escaping his throat. Startling the driver, he demanded to know who was responsible, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, promising that whoever did this would pay with their life. The CFO on the phone was sobbing now, saying that the IT team was tracing the IP address, but the attacker was bouncing the signal through servers in Russia, China, and Brazil. However, the attacker had left a digital signature, a mocking calling card embedded in the source code of the virus. Ethan demanded to know what the signature was. The CFO hesitated, terrified of the answer. Before whispering that the hacker had signed off as 0, Ethan froze, the name echoing in his mind. A name he had never heard but now hated more than anything on earth. He ordered the driver to turn the car around and head to the headquarters immediately. He would not sleep. He would not eat, until he hunted down this 0 and destroyed them. He dialed his head of private security, a former mercenary named Marcus, and gave the order to mobilize the entire cyber warfare unit. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows across our small apartment. But for the first time in years, I did not feel the crushing weight of impending doom. There was no pounding on the door, no screaming Mr. Russo, because his account had been fed, silencing his greed for a year. I looked at Leo, who was sleeping soundly on the mattress, his face innocent and soft, looking nothing like the digital predator who had brought a billionaire to his knees the night before. But my relief was short-lived, replaced by a cold knot of anxiety in my stomach. I knew Ethan Sterling better than anyone. I knew that he was a man who never lost without seeking vengeance. He would tear the city apart to find the person who humiliated him. I turned on the small television in the corner, the morning news anchor speaking in a grave tone. The headline at the bottom of the screen read that Sterling Capital had suffered a mysterious cyber attack, causing a panic on Wall Street. The reporters speculated that it was a foreign government or a rival corporation, but I knew the truth. The enemy was sleeping in my bed, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. I realized then that we were no longer just hiding. We were now active targets in a game that could get us killed. I walked over to the window, peering through the cracked blinds at the street below. My heart skipping a beat when I saw a black SUV parked across the street. It was identical to the security vehicles that followed Ethan, its tinted windows hiding whoever was watching. Panic surged through me, my hands gripping the sill, wondering if they had found us already. I shook Leo gently, waking him up, telling him we needed to be ready to run. Leo sat up, rubbing his eyes, and calmly glanced at the window. He told me that they could not have found his location yet, because he had routed the signal through 3 different continents. He said the car outside was likely just a coincidence, or perhaps surveillance for someone else in the neighborhood. But then, his tablet beeped, a single, sharp sound that cut through the morning quiet. Leo looked at the screen, his eyes narrowing, and said that someone was pinging the local cell tower, scanning for high-frequency data usage. He looked at me, his face serious, and said that Ethan's security team was smarter than he thought. They were not looking for an IP address. They were looking for the hardware signature of the device that executed the code. Leo quickly shut down his laptop, pulling the battery out, and told me that we had to leave the apartment immediately. We grabbed our few belongings, stuffing clothes into plastic bags, the fear of capture making my movements clumsy and frantic. I checked the peephole, seeing the hallway was empty, and we slipped out, moving silently down the back stairs. The smell of garbage and damp concrete filled the stairwell, but we did not stop until we reached the alleyway behind the building. The cold air hit my face, shocking my senses. As we hurried toward the subway station, I held Leo's hand so tight I feared I was hurting him. But he did not complain. He just kept pace, his eyes scanning the surroundings like a soldier. We blended into the morning crowd of commuters, becoming invisible once again. Just 2 more faces in the sea of struggling New Yorkers. As we descended into the subway, I looked back one last time and saw 2 men in dark suits entering our apartment building. They were not police. They were Ethan's private cleaners, men who made problems disappear. If we had stayed 5 minutes longer, we would have been trapped. We boarded the train, the doors closing just as the men stepped onto the street, scanning the crowd. I pulled Leo close, whispering that we were safe for now. But Leo shook his head. He looked up at me and said that we were not running away. We were simply repositioning. He told me that the attack on the real estate project was just a warning shot, and now that he knew Ethan was coming for us, he would have to aim for the head. The train rattled through the dark tunnel, the lights flickering, mirroring the chaos in my mind. I asked Leo what he meant, begging him to stop before we got killed. Leo looked at his reflection in the dark window, his expression hardening. He said that Ethan Sterling cared about 2 things, his money and his reputation. He had taken the money, and now he was going to take the reputation. Leo revealed that while he was in the server, he had found a folder encrypted with a biometric lock. He had not opened it yet, but the file name was referenced in emails between Ethan and a woman named Sophia. The file was labeled The Clinic. Leo explained that if he could crack that file, he would have the weapon to destroy Ethan completely. I froze, remembering the clinic where I had given birth, the place where Sophia had arranged the fake DNA test. If that file contained the proof of their deception, it would be the end of Ethan's engagement and his control over the company. But it would also mean that Ethan would have nothing left to lose. I looked at my son, realizing that he was not just defending us, he was hunting them. The train screeched to a halt at our stop, and we stepped out onto the platform, walking into the unknown. We were homeless again, but this time, we were armed with a secret that was worth billions. I pushed open the greasy glass door of the diner where I used to work, pulling Leo close to my leg, hoping to collect my last paycheck of $300 before we disappeared into the city's underbelly. The manager, a man named Joe who had always smiled at me, refused to meet my eyes as he wiped the counter with a dirty rag, his hands trembling slightly. I sensed the trap a second too late, turning to leave. But the exit was blocked by 3 men in dark, expensive suits who looked nothing like regular customers. They were not police officers. They were private asset recovery agents, hired thugs with law degrees who specialized in intimidation for the ultra-wealthy. The man in the center, whose name was Graves, stepped forward with a predatory smile. Blocking my path with his massive frame, he did not introduce himself. He simply slammed a leather folder onto the nearest table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Graves informed me that I was being sued for damages caused at the Plaza Hotel, claiming that my son had destroyed property worth $50,000. He told me that my bank accounts were already frozen, and since I had no assets to seize, his client had authorized him to collect the debt through alternative means. I gripped Leo's hand so tight my knuckles turned white, realizing that Sophia had not just fired me. She had put a bounty on my head. Graves motioned for his men to surround us, forcing me into a booth, trapping us between the wall and their imposing bodies. He pulled out a sleek black phone, dialed a number, and placed it on the table with the speakerphone on, the volume set to maximum. Sophia Vance's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp, devoid of any humanity, sounding like she was ordering a drink rather than destroying a life. She told me that she knew I was trying to run, but in New York, nobody runs from the Sterling family without permission. She said that she was a generous woman, so she would offer me a deal to wipe the debt clean and keep me out of prison. Graves slid a document across the table, the paper thick and heavy, the header reading Voluntary Organ Donation Agreement. I read the fine print, my breath catching in my throat. Realizing this was a contract to sell my kidney to a private recipient on the black market, Sophia explained that she had a friend in need of a transplant, and since I was a match based on my old employee health records, this was my only way to pay for my sins. She told me that if I signed, she would give me $10,000 and a bus ticket out of the state. If I refused, she would have Leo arrested for juvenile cyberterrorism, a charge that would put him in a maximum security facility until he was 18. I looked at the contract, the letters swimming before my eyes, the reality of the situation crashing down on me like a concrete wall. They wanted to harvest my body parts to settle a fake debt, treating me like livestock in a slaughterhouse. Graves uncapped a pen, the click sounding ominously loud, and shoved it into my trembling hand, his grip bruising my wrist. He whispered that the car was waiting outside to take me to a private clinic in the Hamptons, where the procedure would be done immediately. I looked at Leo, his small face pale but his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. Scanning the faces of the men who threatened his mother, I knew Sophia was not bluffing. She had the money and the connections to make Leo disappear into the system forever if I did not comply. I felt the tears hot and stinging in my eyes, the pen shaking in my fingers. As I moved the tip toward the signature line, I was ready to give up a part of myself to save my son, to accept the physical mutilation as the price for his freedom. But before the ink could touch the paper, Leo climbed onto the booth seat, standing tall despite his small stature. He looked directly at Graves, his voice steady and devoid of fear. and asked the man if he had checked his personal offshore account in the Cayman Islands recently. Graves paused, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, his arrogance wavering for a split second as he looked at the 5-year-old boy. Leo continued, speaking rapidly, reciting a string of numbers that I realized were bank account routing codes. He told Graves that he had just liquidated the man's entire retirement fund, along with the illegal bribes Graves had taken from other clients over the last 10 years. Leo tapped the screen of his cracked tablet, the device emitting a low hum, and turned it around to show Graves the display. The screen showed a bank balance of $0.00, followed by a notification that the funds had been donated to a charity for victims of loan sharks. Graves turned pale, his hands shaking as he pulled out his own phone to check his banking app, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the empty balance. The other two men looked at each other, uncertain and fearful, stepping back from the table as if Leo were a radioactive weapon. Leo did not stop there. He looked at the phone on the table where Sophia was still listening and said that her turn was coming next. He told her that he knew about the fake invoices she used to launder money through her charity, and he had just emailed the evidence to the IRS. Sophia screamed through the phone, her composure shattering instantly, ordering Graves to grab the boy and smash the tablet immediately. Graves lunged forward, his face twisted in rage, abandoning all pretense of legality, reaching out to choke Leo. I screamed, throwing my body over my son to shield him, preparing for the blow that would surely break my bones. But Leo was faster, his finger pressing a red button on his screen that executed a command he had prepared minutes ago. Suddenly, the fire suppression system of the diner erupted, the sprinklers overhead spraying a torrent of black, oily water onto the men. The fire alarm blared, a deafening siren that disoriented everyone, creating instant chaos in the small space. Graves slipped on the wet floor, crashing into the table, while the other men covered their heads, blinded by the water. I grabbed Leo, adrenaline surging through my veins, and we scrambled out of the booth, slipping and sliding toward the kitchen exit. We burst out into the alleyway, the cold winter air biting my wet skin. But we did not stop running. We sprinted down the dark alley, jumping over trash bags, the sound of Graves yelling threats fading behind us. We reached the main street and jumped into a yellow taxi just as it pulled up to the curb. I gave the driver a random address in Queens, my chest heaving, my clothes soaked and freezing, holding Leo close to keep him warm. I looked at my son, expecting to see fear, but he was calm, wiping the water from his tablet screen with his sleeve. He told me that we could not go to the police, because Sophia owned the precinct captain. So we had to fight fire with fire. He opened a new window on his device, his fingers flying across the virtual keyboard, drafting an email that would change the course of the war. He told me that he was sending a direct message to Ethan Sterling's personal, encrypted server, a place that no one was supposed to have access to. The message was simple, a declaration of total war. It read that his fiancée had tried to harvest my organs, and because of that, Leo was going to release the clinic file in 24 hours. I asked him what was in the file, my heart pounding in my throat. Leo looked up at me, his eyes dark and serious, and said that the file contained the proof that Sophia had faked a pregnancy 5 years ago to trap Ethan. But more importantly, the file contained the unredacted birth records from the hospital, proving that Ethan was Leo's father. Leo pressed send, the progress bar completing instantly. He said that now Ethan would have to choose between saving his company or destroying the woman who lied to him. Ethan Sterling stared at the glowing screen of his phone, the blue light reflecting in his cold eyes as he read the email from Zero for the 10th time. The subject line was simply, "The clinic file," and the attachment was a blurred image of a hospital admission form dated 5 years ago, bearing Sophia's name and a diagnosis code that made his blood run cold. He sat in the back of his armored Rolls-Royce, his hand gripping the leather armrest so hard the material creaked, signaling his driver to ignore all traffic laws and head straight to Mount Sinai Hospital. He knew that code. It was not for a miscarriage, as Sophia had claimed amidst tears and broken glass 5 years ago. It was a code for a cosmetic procedure, a tummy tuck that she had undergone while supposedly 4 months pregnant with his heir. The realization that he might have been played for a fool by the woman who wore his ring was a humiliation he could not stomach, a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial loss. He dialed the private number of the hospital's chief of staff, a man whose career Ethan had bought and paid for, and ordered him to seal the physical archives immediately. He told the terrified doctor that if a single piece of paper regarding Sophia Vance left that basement, the hospital would lose its funding by morning. Ethan hung up, his jaw set in a grim line, realizing that if Sophia had lied about the baby she lost, then the child she claimed was a stranger's brat at the gala might actually be the heir he had mourned for half a decade. Sophia Vance was already moving, her red Ferrari weaving through the Manhattan traffic like a desperate bullet, her hands shaking on the steering wheel as she screamed into her headset. She called Graves, the debt collector who was currently hunting Ava, and told him to forget the woman for a moment and get to the hospital archives before Ethan did. She promised him triple his usual fee, offering him enough money to retire in the Caribbean, if he could locate box number 402 and burn it to ashes. She knew that Ethan was suspicious. She had seen the way he looked at her after the gala, a look of calculating coldness that usually preceded a corporate liquidation. If he found the original medical charts, he would see that her uterus had been empty the entire time she played the grieving mother, a performance that had secured her engagement ring. She slammed on the brakes as a taxi cut her off, her heart pounding against her ribs, knowing that this was a race for her survival. She told Graves that she did not care about the fire alarms or the security guards. He had permission to use lethal force if necessary to secure the objective. She needed that file gone. She needed the past to be erased, because without the lie of the lost child, she was just another socialite with a dwindling trust fund and a lot of enemies. Ava huddled in the back of a yellow taxi, watching Leo's small fingers dance across his tablet, overriding the hospital's visitor log system to create fake IDs for us. We were heading into the lion's den, returning to the place where my life had fallen apart 5 years ago, but Leo insisted that the digital copy was not enough. He explained that Ethan was a man of tangible proof, a man who needed to hold the paper in his hand to believe the betrayal, so we had to get the physical file before Sophia destroyed it. I looked at the looming white building of the hospital, a fortress of secrets, and felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I told Leo that this was dangerous, that we were walking into a trap set by people with no morals, but he just looked at me with those calm, analytical eyes. He said that the trap was already sprung, and now we were just rearranging the bait. He handed me a stolen doctor's coat he had swiped from a laundry cart outside, telling me to put it on and walk with confidence. He said that people in hospitals never question a doctor who looks busy. They only question people who look afraid. We stepped out of the taxi, the cold wind whipping my hair, and I put on the coat, transforming from a fugitive mother into a staff member, holding Leo's hand as we marched toward the service entrance. We slipped past the security desk, blending into the shift change, and made our way to the service elevator that led to the basement archives. The air in the elevator was stale and smelled of antiseptic, the silence amplifying the beating of my heart. Leo watched the floor numbers descend, his face impassive, counting down the seconds until the doors would open. He told me that Graves was already in the building, His phone signal was pinging from the lower level, which meant we were minutes behind the enemy. The elevator dinged, the doors sliding open to reveal a dimly lit corridor lined with rows of metal shelves, a labyrinth of paper and dust. We heard the sound of heavy boots and the tearing of cardboard coming from the end of the hall. I pulled Leo behind a stack of boxes, peering around the corner to see Graves dousing a pile of files with lighter fluid, the pungent smell of chemicals filling the confined space. He was working fast, muttering curses, searching for the specific box Sophia had ordered him to destroy. Leo tapped my arm, pointing to the fire suppression system on the ceiling, and then to a red lever on the wall near us. He whispered that we could not use the sprinklers again because it would ruin the ink on the documents we needed to save. Instead, he pulled a small, high-pitched alarm device from his pocket, a gadget he had built from scraps, and rolled it down the hallway. The device stopped right behind Graves and emitted a sound exactly like a police siren, piercing and loud, echoing off the concrete walls. Graves spun around, dropping the lighter fluid, his hand going for the gun inside his jacket, thinking the cops had arrived. In that split second of distraction, Leo sprinted forward, small and fast, sliding under the metal shelving unit to the other side of the aisle. He grabbed the box labeled Vance Sophia from the cart Graves had pushed aside and swapped it with a box labeled Vaccination Records that sat on the floor. It was a sleight of hand he must have practiced 1,000 times in his mind, executed with the precision of a street magician. Graves realized the siren was fake, a growl of rage erupting from his throat as he kicked the device, crushing it. He turned back to the pile, grabbing the box he thought was the target, the one Leo had just swapped, and flicked his lighter. The flames roared to life, consuming the papers instantly, the fire reflecting in Graves's eyes as he believed he was burning the evidence of Sophia's fake pregnancy. I watched from the shadows, holding my breath, terrified that he would notice the label. But he was too focused on the destruction. He laughed, a cruel, satisfied sound, pulling out his phone to call Sophia and report the success of his mission. Suddenly, the heavy iron doors at the entrance of the archives burst open, slamming against the walls with a thunderous crash. Ethan Sterling strode in, flanked by 4 armed security guards, his face a mask of terrifying fury. He saw the fire, he saw Graves standing over the burning pile, and he saw the red canister of lighter fluid. Ethan did not ask questions. He simply pointed at Graves, and his security team moved in like a pack of wolves. 2 guards tackled Graves before he could reach for his weapon, pinning him to the concrete floor, while the other 2 used extinguishers to put out the fire. Ethan walked over to the charred remains of the box, picking up a half-burnt piece of paper, his eyes scanning the text. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on the shadows where I was hiding. He ordered us to come out, his voice low and dangerous, stating that he knew we were there because he had tracked Leo's tablet signal. I stepped out, holding Leo's hand, my legs trembling, facing the man who had ruined my life and the man who was currently pinned to the floor. Ethan looked at me, then at Leo, and demanded to know why we were conspiring with a criminal to burn his wife's medical records. He accused me of trying to blackmail him, of trying to destroy the last memory of his unborn child. Sophia Vance ran into the room, her heels clicking frantically on the concrete, her hair disheveled and her eyes wild with panic. She saw Graves on the floor, she saw the burnt box, and a look of immense relief washed over her face, quickly replaced by a mask of fake outrage. She rushed to Ethan's side, grabbing his arm, pointing a shaking finger at me. She screamed that I was a monster, that I had hired this thug to burn the records of her tragic miscarriage because I was jealous of her life. She claimed that I wanted to erase the existence of Ethan's child so I could push my bastard son into the family line. It was a perfect lie. delivered with tears and trembling lips, turning the situation completely around. Ethan looked at the burnt box, then at Sophia's tear-stained face, and for a moment, doubt clouded his eyes. He looked at me with renewed disgust, believing her narrative that I was the villain who desecrated the memory of his lost heir. He stepped toward me, his voice cold as ice, telling me that I had crossed a line that could not be forgiven. He said he would ensure I spent the rest of my life in federal prison for arson and extortion. Leo stepped in front of me, shielding me from Ethan's looming figure. His small body tense, but his chin held high. He looked at his father and told him to stop being an emotional fool and start acting like a CEO. Leo pointed to the burnt box on the floor and told Ethan to actually read the label on the charred cardboard. Ethan frowned, looking down at the soggy, blackened box, and read the partial text that remained visible. It said, "Inventory 2018, not medical records." Sophia froze, her crying stopping instantly, her eyes widening in horror. Leo walked over to the shelf behind him, the one he had hidden behind, and pulled out the pristine, untouched box labeled Vance Sophia. He threw it on the table in front of Ethan, the sound of the heavy box landing with a thud that silenced the room. Leo said that he knew Sophia would try to burn the truth. So he had switched the boxes while Graves was distracted by the siren. He told Ethan to open it, to look at the ultrasound scans that were blank, to look at the doctor's notes that detailed a tummy tuck surgery scheduled on the exact day she claimed to have miscarried. Leo crossed his arms, staring at Sophia with a look of pure victory, and said that the only thing she had burned was a stack of old cafeteria receipts. Ethan's hands shook as he opened the box, pulling out the files one by one, his eyes scanning the documents that Leo had preserved. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of paper turning and Sophia's ragged breathing. Ethan stopped at a particular document, a waiver for anesthesia signed by Sophia, dated 5 years ago, for an elective cosmetic procedure. He looked up at Sophia, the betrayal in his eyes turning into a dark, murderous rage. He asked her, in a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout, where his child was. Sophia stammered, backing away, hitting the metal shelves, trying to find a lie that could save her. But the paper trail was undeniable. She looked at Graves, who was handcuffed on the floor, then at me, her eyes filled with venom. She suddenly laughed, a high-pitched hysterical sound, and said that it didn't matter. She told Ethan that even if she faked the pregnancy, he could not touch her because her father's media empire controlled Sterling Capital's public image. She threatened that if he exposed her, she would tell the world about the Sterling curse, a secret that would tank his stock value to zero. Ethan ignored her threat, turning his attention to the second file Leo had placed on top of the stack. It was a DNA test. Not the fake one from the gala, but a new one Leo had run using the sample he stole from Ethan's office trash can days ago, compared against his own saliva. Ethan read the results, the percentage of 99.9% probability staring back at him. He looked at Leo, really looked at him for the first time, seeing his own eyes, his own jawline, the same intelligence that he prided himself on. The realization hit him like a physical blow, staggering him. He looked at me, his eyes searching for confirmation, for the truth he had denied for 5 years, but before he could speak, before he could claim his son. Leo stepped back, grabbing my hand. Leo told Ethan that biology did not make him a father, it just made him a donor. He said that we did not want his money or his name. We just wanted him to know what he had thrown away. Leo pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. Suddenly, the lights in the archive room went out, plunging us into total darkness. In the confusion, Leo guided me toward the emergency exit he had hacked earlier, leaving Ethan standing in the dark with the proof of his stupidity in his hands. Ethan Sterling stood in the suffocating darkness of the hospital archives, the only light coming from the emergency exit sign that cast a blood-red glow over the DNA test trembling in his hand. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of Sophia Vance, who was currently cowering in the corner like a trapped rat. Ethan did not look at her. He could not bear to look at the woman who had stolen 5 years of his life with a lie, because if he did, he might do something that would send him to prison for life. He pulled out his satellite phone, the signal piercing through the concrete walls, and dialed his head of security, Marcus. His voice was a low growl, devoid of the usual corporate polish. As he ordered Marcus to lock down the perimeter of the Upper East Side, he commanded his private army to find a woman in a stolen doctor's coat and a 5-year-old boy with a laptop. But he added a stipulation that made his voice crack for the first time in a decade. He said that if anyone touched a hair on the boy's head, or harmed the woman, he would personally execute them in the street. Ethan hung up, pocketing the phone, and finally turned his gaze to Sophia. He told her that her father's media empire could not save her from the hell he was about to unleash, but Sophia simply smoothed her hair, her fear replaced by a cold, venomous resolve. She whispered that by the time he found his bastard son, the world would see Ava Miller not as a victim, but as a deranged criminal who kidnapped a child to extort a billionaire. Sophia was not bluffing, because the moment she stepped out of the hospital, she activated the nuclear option that only a media mogul's daughter possessed. Within 10 minutes, every digital billboard in Times Square, every smartphone notification, and every taxi TV screen in New York City flashed with a breaking news alert. The headline was screaming in bold red letters, claiming that a mentally unstable former employee had kidnapped a child from the Sterling Gala. Sophia Vance appeared on the screen, her makeup artfully smudged to look like a distraught mother, sobbing fake tears as she pleaded for the safe return of the boy she claimed was her nephew. She twisted the narrative with terrifying efficiency, painting Ava as a dangerous gold digger who had suffered a psychotic break after being fired. She offered a reward of $50,000 to any citizen who could detain the suspect, effectively turning 8 million New Yorkers into bounty hunters. I stood on the corner of Lexington Avenue, staring up at a giant screen where my face was plastered next to the word "Wanted." People on the sidewalk stopped, their eyes darting from their phones to me, the recognition dawning on their faces like predators spotting wounded prey. I pulled Leo's hood down over his face, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and dragged him into a nearby alleyway. We ran through the labyrinth of back streets, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance, closing in on us from all sides. Leo looked at his tablet, his small fingers flying across the screen, but for the first time, frustration creased his brow. He told me that Sophia's father, Richard Vance, had utilized military-grade signal jammers in the area to prevent Leo from hacking the broadcast. We were digitally blind, cut off from the network that was Leo's only weapon, forcing us to rely on physical survival in a city that wanted to sell us for $50,000. We ducked into a 24-hour convenience store, hoping to find a back exit, but the clerk behind the counter froze. He looked at the TV screen above the register, then at me, and his hand slowly reached for the silent alarm button under the counter. I shook my head, pleading with my eyes, begging him to see that I was just a mother trying to protect her child. But the promise of the reward was too strong, and he shouted for the customers to grab us. A group of 3 men near the door, emboldened by the news report that called me dangerous, lunged forward to block our path. One of them, a heavy man in a delivery uniform, grabbed my arm with bruising force, twisting it behind my back. He shouted that he had got the kidnapper, holding me down while I screamed for Leo to run. The convenience store became a cage of chaos, with customers pulling out their phones to record the assault instead of helping. Their flashes blinding me. I struggled against the man's grip, kicking and biting, the primal instinct to reach my son giving me strength I did not know I had. Leo did not run. He stood his ground, pulling a small canister of pepper spray from his backpack, a weapon I did not know he carried. He sprayed a cloud of burning mist into the face of the man holding me, causing him to howl in pain and release his grip. I grabbed Leo, coughing from the fumes, and we burst out of the store onto the sidewalk. But the commotion had attracted a crowd, a mob of pedestrians, fueled by the lies on the news and the mob mentality of social media justice, formed a tight circle around us. They shouted insults, calling me a child abuser and a thief, some even throwing half-empty coffee cups and trash at us. I wrapped my body around Leo, shielding him from the debris, crouching on the cold pavement as the circle tightened. I felt a hand grab my hair, yanking my head back, and I closed my eyes, preparing for the violence that the city was about to inflict on us. I whispered to Leo that I was sorry, that I had failed to get us out. But Leo just held my hand, his grip unyielding. Suddenly, the roar of engines drowned out the shouting of the mob, and a convoy of black-armored SUVs screeched to a halt at the curb. Mounting the sidewalk, the doors flew open, and 12 men in tactical gear poured out, forming a protective wall between us and the crowd, pushing the aggressive bystanders back with professional efficiency. The mob fell silent, the scent of real power silencing their fake outrage. As the door of the lead vehicle opened, Ethan Sterling stepped out, not as the cold CEO from the gala, but as a man possessed by a terrifying desperation. He did not look at the cameras. He did not look at the crowd. He walked straight toward us, his eyes locked on Leo. He saw the coffee stain on my coat. He saw the bruise forming on my arm, and a look of pure murder crossed his face. He turned to the man who had pulled my hair, who was now cowering behind a trash can, and spoke in a voice that carried over the wind. Ethan stated that if anyone touched his wife or his son again, he would sue them until their grandchildren were born in debt, and then he would have them thrown in a prison so deep they would never see the sun. The crowd gasped, phones recording the revelation, the narrative of the nanny crumbling instantly under the weight of his declaration. Ethan knelt down on the dirty pavement, disregarding his $3,000 suit, and reached out a trembling hand toward Leo. His eyes were red, filled with a mixture of awe and agonizing regret. As he looked at the boy who was the spitting image of himself, he whispered Leo's name, his voice breaking, telling him that he was safe now, that nobody would ever hurt him again. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw shame in his eyes, a deep, hollow shame that stripped away his arrogance. He told me to get in the car, promising that he would take us to the penthouse, that he would fix everything, that he would destroy Sophia for what she had done. He reached out to help me up, acting the part of the protective husband, trying to erase 5 years of neglect with one grand gesture. But as his fingers brushed my arm, Leo stepped in between us. Leo slapped Ethan's hand away, the sound sharp and shocking in the quiet street. Leo looked at his father with eyes that were too old for a 5-year-old, eyes that held zero warmth, only cold calculation. He told Ethan that we did not need his protection, and we certainly did not need his charity. Leo said that Ethan was only here because the math had changed, because Leo was now an asset instead of a liability. Ethan froze, his hand hovering in the air, the rejection hitting him harder than any corporate loss. He tried to argue, saying that he was his father, that they were family. But Leo cut him off with a ruthless logic that mirrored Ethan's own business style. Leo stated that a father is a role defined by presence and care, neither of which Ethan had provided. Leo pointed at the cameras surrounding them and said that Ethan was only claiming them now to save his stock price from tanking when the truth about Sophia came out. Leo declared that he was not a son to be claimed, he was an independent party, and he was officially serving Ethan with a notice of separation. Leo turned to the nearest camera, looking directly into the lens, and spoke to the world. He announced that he was indeed Ethan Sterling's biological son, but he was rejecting the Sterling name. He said that if Ethan tried to force us into his car, Leo would release the Black Ledger, a file containing every illegal bribe Sterling Capital had paid to city officials in the last decade. The threat hung in the air, tangible and deadly. Ethan looked at his son, realizing that he had not bred a successor. He had bred a conqueror who was holding a gun to his head. The police sirens finally arrived, blocking the street from both ends, blue and red lights flashing against the glass buildings. Sophia Vance stepped out of a police cruiser, flanked by the police commissioner himself, a man who played golf with her father. She pointed a manicured finger at me and screamed that I was armed and dangerous, ordering the police to arrest me immediately. The commissioner, caught between the media narrative and Ethan Sterling, hesitated. Ethan stood up, placing his body between the police and us. Facing the barrel of the guns, he looked at Sophia, his face hardening into stone, and told the commissioner that if he arrested the mother of his child, Ethan would withdraw his funding for the police pension fund by morning. It was a standoff of titans. Money versus power versus media, all played out on a dirty street corner. But Leo tugged on my hand, pulling me back toward the subway entrance that the police had failed to block. He whispered that, while the giants were fighting, the mice would steal the cheese. He had hacked the traffic grid during the standoff, turning all the lights green for a getaway, but not for us. He had summoned a ride share under a fake name, which pulled up right next to the police barricade. We jumped in as Ethan screamed for us to wait, the car peeling away just as the police moved to secure the scene. As we drove away, I looked back to see Ethan standing alone in the circle of lights, a king without a kingdom, realizing he had won the battle but lost the war. Ethan Sterling stood alone on the sidewalk, the red taillights of the ride-share vehicle fading into the chaotic traffic of Manhattan, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his son's rejection ringing in his ears. His phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket, a relentless buzzing that signaled the beginning of the end, and when he looked at the screen, the name Richard Vance was flashing like a warning sign. Ethan answered the call, his voice devoid of emotion, expecting a father's rage, but instead he heard the calm, calculated tone of a man who was about to execute a business merger. Richard Vance did not scream about his daughter's heartbreak. He simply informed Ethan that the alliance between their families was terminated effective immediately. He stated that the live feed of Ethan abandoning Sophia for a fugitive and a bastard child had already caused Sterling Capital's stock to drop by 12% in after-hours trading. Richard added that he had just instructed his media conglomeration, which owned 3 major news networks and half the tabloids in the country, to run a 24-hour special on Ethan's mental instability. He told Ethan that by tomorrow morning, the world would not see a grieving father. They would see a manic depressive CEO who was unfit to manage a lemonade stand, let alone a hedge fund. Ethan tried to speak, to threaten him back, but Richard cut the line with a soft click, the sound of a guillotine blade dropping on Ethan's career. The attack was immediate and total, hitting Ethan from every screen in Times Square, where his face was now replaced by unflattering photos from his college days and manipulated headlines questioning his sanity. I sat in the back of the generic sedan with Leo, watching the live stream on his tablet, seeing the empire of the man who had hunted us crumbling in real time. The news anchors were already speculating about a moral clause violation in Ethan's contract, a legal loophole that would allow the board of directors to fire him without severance. Leo watched the financial graphs plummet with a scowl, his small face illuminated by the red lines of the stock crash, looking less like a child and more like a general watching a losing battle. He tapped the screen aggressively, muttering that Richard Vance was a chaotic element, a blunt instrument who was destroying the value of the company that Leo intended to conquer. I touched Leo's shoulder, telling him that this was good for us, that if Ethan was destroyed, he would have no power to hurt us anymore. But Leo shook his head, his eyes cold and sharp, and told me that I was thinking like a victim, not a strategist. He explained that if Richard Vance destroyed Ethan, the Vance family would buy up Sterling Capital for pennies on the dollar, becoming an unstoppable monopoly that would hunt us down just to tie up loose ends. Ethan arrived at the glass tower of Sterling Capital, pushing through a phalanx of paparazzi who shoved cameras in his face, their flashes blinding him like strobe lights in a nightmare. He stormed into the lobby, expecting the usual deference from his staff, but the security guards at the turnstiles did not step aside. They stood their ground with crossed arms. The head of building security, a man Ethan had hired and given a Christmas bonus to every year, looked at him with an apology in his eyes and pointed to the elevator bank. He told Ethan that the board of directors was currently in an emergency session on the 50th floor, and they had suspended Ethan's security clearance pending the vote. Ethan laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and vaulted over the turnstile before they could stop him. Sprinting toward the private elevator that only responded to his biometrics, he slammed his hand against the scanner, the light turning green before the system could update the lockout protocol, and the doors slid shut just as security reached him. He rode the elevator up, the silence of the cabin pressing against his eardrums, knowing that he was about to walk into his own execution. He adjusted his tie, wiping the sweat from his forehead, preparing to face the sharks he had fed for 10 years, knowing that they smell blood in the water. The doors opened to the boardroom, revealing a long mahogany table filled with 12 men and women who held the fate of his life's work in their hands. At the head of the table sat Richard Vance, not as a guest, but as the majority shareholder proxy, holding the voting rights of the panic-stricken investors. Richard smiled, a thin, reptilian expression, and slid a single piece of paper across the polished wood toward the empty seat at the foot of the table. He told Ethan that the board had just voted unanimously to invoke the conduct detrimental to the company clause, effectively terminating Ethan's position as CEO immediately. Richard explained that the video of Ethan threatening the police commissioner, combined with the kidnapping scandal involving a known fugitive, made him a liability that the shareholders could not afford. Ethan looked at the faces of his allies, people he had made rich, but they all looked away, studying their expensive pens or their tablets. Richard leaned forward, his voice dripping with false sympathy, and said that they would allow Ethan to resign for health reasons if he signed a non-compete agreement and transferred his voting shares to a blind trust controlled by the Vance family. It was not a firing. It was a hostile takeover disguised as an intervention, a theft of billions executed with a fountain pen. Back in the safe house, a grimy motel room in Queens that Leo had rented using a stolen credit card, the air was thick with tension. Leo paced the room, the worn carpet beneath his sneakers doing little to muffle his frustration, while I sat on the edge of the sagging bed. He told me that Richard Vance was too greedy, that by ousting Ethan so quickly, Vance had left a digital footprint that was sloppy and arrogant. Leo stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes serious, and said that we had to make a choice that defied all emotional logic. He said that we had to save Ethan Sterling. I stared at him, thinking he was joking, reminding him that Ethan was the man who had let us suffer for 5 years. Leo nodded, acknowledging the pain, but clarified that we were not saving Ethan the father. We were saving Ethan the weapon. He explained that without Ethan's biometric access codes, Leo could not get into the deepest level of the Sterling servers to destroy Richard Vance. Leo pulled out his burner phone, dialing a number that he had memorized from the stolen files, the private line that rang directly to the phone in Ethan's pocket. He told me that sometimes, to kill a monster, you have to feed it first. And right now, Ethan was starving for revenge. Ethan stood in the boardroom, the resignation paper in his hand, feeling the weight of total defeat crushing his chest. His phone rang, a shrill sound in the quiet room, and everyone turned to look at him. He saw the unknown number and almost silenced it. But something, perhaps a desperate instinct, made him answer. He put the phone to his ear, saying nothing, and heard a small, distorted voice on the other end that sent a shiver down his spine. Leo did not say hello. He simply asked Ethan if he wanted to die on his knees or live to burn the building down. Ethan looked at Richard Vance, who was checking his watch with an air of boredom, and felt a spark of rage ignite in the ashes of his pride. He asked the voice what the price was. Leo replied that the price was 51% of the company, legally transferred to Leo upon victory, and full immunity for me. Ethan looked at the contract on the table, then at the sharks surrounding him, and realized he had nothing left to lose but his chains. He told the board members that he needed a moment to consult with his legal counsel, turning his back on them to walk toward the window. He whispered to Leo that he accepted the terms, asking what the first move was. Leo told him to sign nothing, to smash the fire alarm on the wall, and to get to the roof immediately. I watched Leo orchestrate the escape from a distance, his fingers moving across his keyboard to hack the building's security grid. He triggered a silent alarm in the Sterling building. Not a fire alarm, but a active shooter protocol, which automatically locked down the elevators and unlocked the emergency stairwells. Inside the boardroom, the lights flashed red, and the heavy magnetic locks on the doors engaged, trapping Richard Vance and the traitors inside. Ethan used the confusion to grab a heavy metal chair and smash the window overlooking the terrace, climbing out into the cold night air just as the security shutters began to descend. He ran toward the helipad, where his private chopper was parked. But the pilot had been ordered to stand down by Richard Vance. Leo, however, had already overridden the pilot's headset frequency. Leo spoke directly to the pilot, mimicking Richard Vance's voice using an AI generator, ordering him to extract Ethan immediately for a secret negotiation. The pilot, confused but obedient to the voice of authority, started the rotors. Ethan jumped into the helicopter as it lifted off, leaving the furious board members pounding on the glass behind him. The helicopter landed in an abandoned industrial park in Brooklyn, the rotors kicking up dust and trash, casting long shadows under the flickering streetlights. I stood there with Leo, wrapping my coat tighter against the wind, watching the fallen king step out of his machine. Ethan looked disheveled, his tie undone, his eyes wild, looking nothing like the billionaire who had sneered at us days ago. He walked toward us, stopping 10 feet away, respecting the invisible barrier Leo had set. He looked at Leo, then at me, and opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize. But Leo held up a hand to silence him. Leo told him that we were not here for a family reunion, so he could save the tears for the press conference. Leo tossed a burner phone to Ethan and said that the device contained the black ledger that Richard Vance thought he had buried. Leo explained that Richard Vance had built his media empire on laundering money for foreign cartels. And the proof was hidden in the metadata of the very news broadcasts he was using to smear Ethan. Leo said that we were going to use Richard's own satellites to broadcast the evidence to the world. But we needed Ethan's retinal scan to authorize the uplink from the Sterling main server. Ethan looked at the phone, then at his son. A mixture of fear and admiration in his eyes. He asked Leo why he was helping the man who had abandoned him. Leo stepped forward, looking up at his father with a gaze that was terrifyingly empty of affection. He told Ethan that he was not helping him. He was simply using him as a battering ram to break down the castle gates. Leo said that once Richard Vance was destroyed, and the company was saved, he would come for Ethan's share next. Ethan smiled, a genuine, sharp smile that matched Leo's, and said that he would expect nothing less. They shook hands, a pact made in hell between a father and son who were more like business rivals than family. I watched them, realizing that the dynamic had shifted completely. We were no longer running. We were the hunters now. Leo turned to me and said that the first step was to clear my name. He told Ethan to use his verified social media account, which Richard Vance had not yet seized, to post a single video. Ethan nodded, holding up the phone, and started a live stream. He looked into the camera, his face bruised and intense, and declared that he was not crazy. He was just angry. He announced that Sophia Vance was a fraud, her father was a criminal, and the woman they called a kidnapper was the only person who had ever told him the truth. As the live stream hit the internet, the viewer count skyrocketed into the millions within seconds, the notification pinging on phones all over the city. Richard Vance, trapped in the Sterling boardroom, watched the video on his phone, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his expensive tie. He screamed at his assistants to cut the feed, to shut down the internet if they had to. But it was too late. The narrative was shifting, the seed of doubt was planted, and the public's thirst for a scandal was turning in our favor. But Richard Vance was not a man who played fair. He picked up his phone and called a number that had no name, only a symbol. He ordered a cleaner team to triangulate the signal of Ethan's live stream and to eliminate the source with extreme prejudice. Back in the industrial park, Leo's tablet beeped with a proximity warning. He looked at the screen and cursed, a word that no 5-year-old should know. He shouted that they had been tracked, that a drone strike was inbound. He grabbed my hand and yelled for Ethan to get back in the helicopter. We scrambled into the cockpit, the pilot panicking as Leo screamed coordinates at him. The helicopter lifted off just as a black drone slammed into the spot where we had been standing, the explosion rocking the aircraft and lighting up the night sky with a ball of fire. The helicopter lurched violently to the left, the metal frame groaning under the stress of the sudden maneuver, throwing me against the cold door while the pilot screamed something unintelligible into his headset. I gripped the safety handle with one hand and wrapped my other arm around Leo, who was staring at his tablet with a terrifying intensity, his fingers moving across the glass like a pianist playing a requiem. The explosion from the first drone had faded, but the threat remained. A second black shape emerging from the smoke below us, its red sensor eye locking onto our tail rotor like a predator stalking its prey. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt, staggering toward the cockpit, his face pale but his eyes burning with a desperate resolve, shouting at the pilot to give him the controls before we were blown out of the sky. The pilot, a young man named Davis who was clearly not trained for combat, was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so hard the cyclic stick was vibrating, threatening to send us spinning into the East River. Ethan grabbed Davis by the shoulder, his voice cutting through the noise of the rotors, ordering him to move or die, pulling the terrified man out of the seat and sliding into the pilot's position himself. Ethan took the controls, his hands moving with muscle memory from his days in the Air Force Reserve. instantly stabilizing the aircraft and banking hard to the right to dodge the incoming projectile. The drone fired a small, kinetic missile that whizzed past our window, missing us by inches, the shockwave rattling the plexiglass and popping my ears. Leo looked up from his screen, his voice calm despite the chaos, announcing that he had established a connection to the Vance Media satellite network. But the upload speed was being throttled by a ground-based jammer. He told us that he needed 3 minutes of uninterrupted signal to override the firewall and broadcast the Black Ledger to every television in America, a task that seemed impossible with a killer drone on our tail. Ethan gritted his teeth, sweat dripping down his temple, and shouted that he could not buy us 3 minutes, he could barely buy us 30 seconds, because the drone was faster and more agile than this executive transport helicopter. He pulled the collective up, sending us shooting toward the skyline of Manhattan, weaving between the skyscrapers to break the drone's line of sight, using the buildings as a shield. The drone was relentless, matching our every move, its AI predicting Ethan's flight path with mathematical precision, closing the distance as we roared past the Empire State Building. Ethan yelled over his shoulder, telling me to look in the emergency kit under the seat and find the flare gun. His voice strained as he fought to keep the helicopter from stalling in a tight turn. I fumbled with the latches of the metal box, my fingers numb from fear, tearing it open to reveal the orange plastic pistol that was our only defense against a machine built for war. I grabbed the flare gun, checking the chamber as Ethan shouted that the drone was locking on again, a high-pitched tone filling the cockpit indicating a missile launch was imminent. He told me to open the side window and wait for his signal, to aim not at the drone itself but at its sensor array, hoping the heat signature would confuse its targeting system. I slid the small window open, the freezing wind blasting into the cabin, stinging my eyes, and leaned out into the void, aiming the gun at the mechanical beast that was chasing us. Ethan screamed for me to fire now, banking the helicopter sharply to expose the drone, and I pulled the trigger, sending a blinding ball of magnesium fire streaking into the night air. The flare exploded right in front of the drone's optical sensors, the intense heat and light blinding its guidance system for a critical second, causing it to veer sharply to the left. The drone slammed into the steel antenna of a radio tower, exploding in a shower of sparks and debris that rained down toward the empty streets below, leaving us alone in the dark sky. Leo tapped the screen one final time, a green progress bar filling to 100%, and announced that the package was delivered, his voice carrying a tone of cold finality. In the boardroom of Sterling Capital, Richard Vance was still screaming at his technicians to cut the feed, unaware that his own satellite had just been weaponized against him. Suddenly, the giant screens on the wall, which were displaying the stock market crash, flickered and changed, replaced by a video file that Leo had extracted from the Black Ledger. The video showed Richard Vance sitting in a dimly lit room, handing a briefcase full of cash to a known cartel leader, discussing the laundering of drug money through his charity foundations. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every incriminating word, broadcasting his crimes to every news channel, every billboard in Times Square, and every smartphone in the country. Richard Vance stared at the screen, his face draining of color, realizing that his empire of lies had crumbled in an instant, destroyed by the very technology he used to control others. His phone began to ring, not with business calls, but with the frantic warnings of his legal team, telling him that federal agents were already breaching the lobby security. Sophia Vance, who had been standing by the window watching the helicopter chase, turned to run toward the private elevator, her heels clicking on the floor in a rhythm of panic. But the heavy oak doors of the boardroom exploded inward, splinters of wood flying across the room, as a team of FBI agents in tactical gear stormed in with weapons drawn, They shouted for everyone to get on the ground, their voices leaving no room for negotiation, moving with the precision of a sledgehammer cracking a walnut. Richard Vance tried to claim diplomatic immunity, blustering about his connections to the president, but the lead agent simply slammed him against the mahogany table, cuffing his hands behind his back. The agent recited his rights, listing charges of money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and domestic terrorism, while Sophia was dragged screaming from the corner where she tried to hide. From the helicopter, we watched the flashing blue lights surround the Sterling building below, a sea of justice swarming the castle of corruption, signaling that the war was finally over. Ethan exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for years, his hands relaxing on the controls as he guided the chopper toward a private helipad on a nearby rooftop. We landed softly, the rotors slowing to a halt, the silence returning to the night. But the tension between us remained as thick as the humid air. Ethan turned in his seat to look at us, his eyes searching for some sign of forgiveness or gratitude. But Leo simply closed his laptop and put it in his backpack. Leo looked at his father and said that the transaction was complete. The company was saved. And Richard Vance was finished, which meant our partnership was concluded. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt, reaching out to touch Leo's shoulder, trying to bridge the gap of 5 years with a single gesture. But I pulled Leo close to me. I told Ethan that saving his life and his company was a business deal, not a family reunion. And he still had a long way to go before he earned the title of father. We climbed out of the helicopter, leaving Ethan sitting alone in the cockpit, a man who had regained his billions, but was still the poorest person on that roof. Ethan Sterling walked through the shattered glass doors of the Sterling Capitol lobby, ignoring the yellow police tape and the forensic teams that were still documenting the earlier raid. His eyes fixed on the elevator bank with a cold, predatory focus. He was not wearing a suit. His white dress shirt was stained with soot and sweat from the helicopter escape. But his presence was more terrifying than it had ever been when he wore Italian silk. The board members who had betrayed him, the men and women who had voted to strip him of his legacy hours ago, were huddled in the conference room on the 50th floor, waiting for their lawyers to arrive. Ethan entered the room, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel sealing a death sentence. He did not sit down. He simply walked to the head of the table, placing his hands on the polished wood, and looked at each traitor in the eye. He told them that their resignations had been accepted effective immediately, but there would be no golden parachutes, no severance packages, and no retention of stock options. He slid a stack of documents across the table, papers that his legal team had drafted in the last 20 minutes, triggering the bad faith clause in their contracts. He informed them that because they had conspired with a known criminal like Richard Vance, he was seizing their personal assets to cover the company's reputational damage. One of the directors, a man named Henderson who had been Ethan's mentor, tried to protest, claiming they had no choice. Ethan silenced him with a look of absolute disgust, whispering that loyalty is a currency. And Henderson was bankrupt. He ordered security to escort them out of the building, not through the VIP exit, but through the front door where the paparazzi were waiting to tear them apart. The elevator doors chimed softly, opening to reveal Ava and Leo standing in the hallway, looking out of place in their worn clothes amidst the marble and gold of the executive floor. Leo walked forward, holding a thick legal binder in his small arms, his face impassive as he approached the man who was technically his father. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, a mix of pride and agonizing regret. As he watched the boy place the binder on the empty boardroom table, Leo opened it to the signature page, pointing to the line that would transfer 51% of the voting shares to a trust under his name. Leo stated that, per their verbal agreement on the helicopter, the price of saving the company was control of the company. Ethan did not hesitate. He did not even read the terms. He simply uncapped his pen and signed his name with a steady hand. He looked at Leo and said that he was giving him not just 51%, but everything. Ethan pushed the binder back, offering his own resignation letter along with the shares, stating that he would step down completely if that was what it took to earn a chance to know his son. He told Ava that he would transfer his personal fortune to her. Billions of dollars. If she would just agree to have dinner with him once a week. It was a desperate plea. A man trying to buy affection because he knew no other language, attempting to trade his empire for a family he had thrown away. Leo looked at the signed documents, then at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Calculating the value of the offer versus the value of the man. He closed the binder, handing it to Ava, and told Ethan that he accepted the shares because that was business. But he rejected the resignation and the money. Leo said that he did not want a retired father who bought his way into forgiveness. He wanted a CEO who could double the value of his new asset. Leo turned to walk away, his rejection stinging more than any insult, stating that their transaction was concluded and he expected a quarterly report by Monday. Ava looked at Ethan, her eyes softening just a fraction, seeing the devastation on his face. She told him that trust is not a stock that can be shorted or bought in bulk. It is a long-term investment that yields slow returns. She turned to follow Leo, walking toward the elevators, leaving Ethan standing alone in the empty boardroom. Ethan ran after them, desperate to say something, anything, to keep them in his orbit for just a minute longer. He caught up to them in the lobby, the space now filled with employees returning to work, the buzz of normalcy trying to return to the chaos. He reached out to touch Leo's shoulder, to beg for a second chance, when he saw a movement in his peripheral vision. A man in a janitor's uniform was pushing a cleaning cart toward them. But his eyes were fixed on Leo with a maniacal intensity, and his hand was reaching into the trash bag on the cart. The world seemed to slow down, the ambient noise of the lobby fading into a dull roar. As Ethan recognized the man, it was Richard Vance's personal driver, a loyalist who had lost everything when his master was arrested, a man who had nothing left to live for but revenge. The driver pulled out a handgun, a silver glint under the chandelier lights, and raised it, aiming not at Ethan, but at the small boy who had destroyed the Vance dynasty. Ethan did not think. He did not calculate the risk. He simply reacted with a primal instinct that overrode every survival mechanism in his brain. He lunged forward, throwing his body in front of Leo, expanding his arms to create a human shield just as the gun went off. The sound of the shot was deafening. A crack of thunder in the enclosed space, followed instantly by the sickening thud of impact. Ethan felt a hammer blow to his chest, a burning sensation that spread rapidly through his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. He collapsed backward, crashing into a marble pillar, sliding down to the floor as his legs gave out. The lobby erupted into chaos, people screaming and diving for cover, security guards tackling the shooter to the ground before he could fire again. But Ethan did not hear the screams. He only heard the sound of Leo's voice calling out. A sound that was no longer cold or calculated, but filled with the terrified panic of a child. I dropped the legal binder, falling to my knees beside Ethan, my hands pressing frantically against the dark stain spreading across his white shirt. The blood was warm and sticky, seeping through my fingers, terrifyingly real against the sterile perfection of the corporate lobby. Ethan coughed, a grimace of pain twisting his face, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked up at me, his eyes losing focus, and then shifted his gaze to Leo, who was standing frozen, his tablet lying forgotten on the floor. Leo stared at his father, his genius brain unable to process the variable of self-sacrifice. his lips trembling as he realized that the man he called a biological donor had just traded his life for him. Ethan reached out a shaking hand, his fingers brushing Leo's sneaker, and whispered that he had finally made a good investment. He tried to smile, to reassure the boy, but the light in his eyes was fading fast, the strength leaving his body with every heartbeat. I screamed for someone to call an ambulance, pressing harder on the wound, begging Ethan to stay awake, telling him that he could not die now, not when he had just started to pay his debt. Ethan looked at me one last time, a tear slipping from the corner of his eye, and whispered that he was sorry for the gala, sorry for the last 5 years, sorry that he was not the man we deserved. His hand fell limp to the floor, his eyes sliding shut, leaving us alone in the center of the panicked crowd. The paramedics arrived in a blur of activity, pushing me aside to work on him, their voices urgent as they shouted medical codes that sounded like a death knell. They loaded Ethan onto a stretcher, rushing him toward the waiting ambulance, the red lights flashing rhythmically against the glass walls of the building he had built. I grabbed Leo's hand, pulling him with me as we ran after the stretcher, ignoring the police who tried to hold us back for questioning. We climbed into the back of the ambulance, the doors slamming shut, enclosing us in the small, sterile box where the fight for Ethan's life was taking place. The paramedic cut open Ethan's shirt, revealing the ugly, dark wound in his chest, and shook his head, muttering that the pulse was thready and weak. Leo sat on the bench, his legs swinging, his eyes fixed on the heart monitor that beeped erratically. He looked at me, his mask of indifference completely shattered, tears streaming down his face for the first time since he was a baby. He asked me if the math was wrong, asked me why Ethan would save him when the probability of survival was 0. I pulled him into my arms, rocking him as the siren wailed, and told him that love is the only variable that mathematics cannot predict. I looked at Ethan's pale face, realizing that in his final act, he had destroyed the monster he used to be, leaving behind a man who might just be worth saving. The sterile smell of the hospital waiting room was a suffocating blanket that wrapped around my throat, making every breath a struggle against the rising tide of panic. I sat on the hard plastic chair, my hands gripping the edge of the seat until my knuckles turned white, staring at the double doors where they had taken Ethan more than 3 hours ago. Leo sat beside me, his legs dangling above the linoleum floor, his usually busy hands resting still in his lap, his tablet forgotten in his backpack for the first time in his life. He was not looking at the financial markets or hacking into the hospital's mainframe. He was simply staring at the scuff marks on the floor, his genius mind unable to calculate the probability of survival for a man who had taken a bullet to the heart. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the unspoken fear that we had finally found a family only to lose it in the same breath. I looked at the clock on the wall, the second hand moving with agonizing slowness, mocking my desperation, and I realized that all the money in the world, all the stock options and power plays, meant absolutely nothing in this room. Ethan Sterling, the man who had commanded billions with a whisper, was now fighting a battle that he could not win with a checkbook. A nurse walked by, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the floor, and I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat, expecting her to deliver the news that would destroy us. But she walked past, leaving us in the purgatory of the unknown, forcing me to confront the terrifying reality that I might still love the man who had ruined me. The double doors finally swung open, the hydraulic hiss sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room, and a surgeon in green scrubs stepped out, pulling a mask down from his face. He looked exhausted, deep circles under his eyes, his gloves stained with the rust-colored evidence of his work. And he scanned the room until his eyes landed on us. I stood up, my legs trembling so badly I had to grab Leo's shoulder for support, and walked toward him, my voice trapped in my chest. The surgeon did not smile. He simply nodded. A professional gesture that conveyed survival but not victory. He told us that the bullet had missed the main artery by less than 2 millimeters. A miracle of physics that defied medical explanation. He said that they had managed to stop the bleeding and repair the damage to the lung, but Ethan was still in a critical condition, induced into a coma to let his body heal from the trauma. He warned us that the next 24 hours would be decisive, that infection or heart failure were still high probabilities, and that we should prepare ourselves for any outcome. I felt a sob break loose from my throat, a sound of relief and terror mixed together, and I sank back onto the chair, burying my face in my hands. Leo stood in front of the doctor, his small face serious, and asked for the specific vitals, the oxygen saturation levels, and the blood pressure readings. The doctor looked at the 5-year-old boy, surprised by the technical questions, but answered him with the respect due to a family member, reciting the numbers that Leo immediately began to process. We were allowed into the intensive care unit an hour later, walking through the dimly lit corridors where the only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of machines and the hushed whispers of nurses. The room was cold, kept at a low temperature to prevent bacterial growth. And in the center of it lay Ethan Sterling, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen him. Tubes ran from his arms and his chest, connecting him to monitors that displayed the jagged lines of his life force, and a ventilator pumped air into his lungs with a mechanical hiss. I walked to the side of the bed, reaching out to touch his hand, which was cold and still, avoiding the wires that taped to his skin. I looked at his face, pale and drawn, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by a vulnerability that broke my heart. Leo stood at the foot of the bed, his hands clutching the railing, his eyes fixed on his father's chest rising and falling. He did not cry. He was analyzing, trying to understand why a man who valued logic above all else would make such an illogical decision. Leo whispered to himself, asking why Ethan would trade a high-value asset like his own life for a low-value asset like a child he barely knew. I moved to stand beside Leo, placing my hand on his head, and told him that value is subjective. I told him that to Ethan. In that split second, Leo was the only asset that mattered, the only legacy that was worth preserving. Leo looked up at me, his eyes wide and confused, struggling to process an equation where love was the variable that changed everything. 2 days passed in a blur of coffee and uncomfortable chairs, the sun rising and setting outside the window while we lived in the timeless bubble of the hospital room. I refused to leave his side, sleeping in the chair, waking up at every change in the monitor's pitch, terrified that silence would follow. On the third morning, as the sun began to filter through the blinds, casting stripes of light across the bed, Ethan's finger twitched against my palm. I froze, holding my breath, watching as his eyelids fluttered, fighting against the weight of the sedation. He opened his eyes, the blue irises cloudy and unfocused, scanning the ceiling before slowly drifting down to find my face. He tried to speak, but the tube in his throat choked him, panic flaring in his eyes for a second before he recognized me. I called for the nurse, who came running to check his vitals and carefully removed the ventilator, telling him to breathe slowly. Ethan coughed, a dry, painful sound, his chest heaving as he took his first breath of air on his own. He looked at me, his voice a raspy whisper that I had to lean in to hear. He asked if Leo was safe. I nodded, tears streaming down my face, pointing to the couch where Leo was asleep, curled up in a ball. Ethan closed his eyes, a single tear slipping out, and whispered that the deal was closed. When Leo woke up and saw his father awake, he did not run to him. He stood by the couch, wary and guarded, holding his tablet like a shield. Ethan propped himself up slightly, wincing from the pain, and beckoned Leo to come closer, his hand shaking as he reached out. Leo walked slowly toward the bed, stopping just out of reach, his face a mask of conflict. Ethan looked at his son and apologized, not for the shooting, but for the years he had missed, for the birthday parties he wasn't there for the first steps he didn't see. He told Leo that he had spent his life building a fortune, thinking that money was the measure of a man. But he realized in the lobby that he was bankrupt in the things that mattered. Ethan said that he had signed the company over because Leo was better than him, smarter than him, and deserved a clean slate to build an empire that wasn't tainted by Richard Vance's corruption. Leo listened, his lower lip trembling, the facade of the cold CEO cracking under the weight of his father's honesty. Leo dropped the tablet on the bed and stepped forward. Grabbing Ethan's hand, he told Ethan that his calculation was wrong. Leo said that a company needs a CEO, but a boy needs a father. And he couldn't fire Ethan from that position because the contract was lifetime. Leo buried his face in the hospital blanket, finally letting go of the genius persona to be just a 5-year-old boy who almost lost his dad. Ethan wrapped his arm around his son, wincing but refusing to let go. And for the first time, I saw the family we could have been, the family we were going to be. The recovery was long and brutal. A month of physical therapy and pain management that tested Ethan's patience more than any hostile takeover. But he did not complain. He treated his recovery like a project, setting goals and crushing them with the same intensity he used to apply to the stock market. But something had changed in him. He no longer checked his phone every 5 minutes. He no longer screamed at nurses for being slow. He spent hours talking to Leo. Not about business, but about coding, about space, about the things that made Leo's eyes light up. I watched them from the doorway, seeing the bond form, a bridge built over the ruins of their past. One afternoon, as Ethan was preparing to be discharged, he asked me to sit down. He handed me a folder, the same legal binder Leo had presented to him, but with a new addendum. He told me that he was legally stepping down as CEO of Sterling Capital, handing the title to a trusted interim board until Leo came of age. But he wanted to apply for a new job. He looked at me with hope in his eyes and asked if I would hire him as a husband and a father. He said the salary was 0. The hours were 24/7. But the benefits included unconditional love and a lifetime of making up for his mistakes. I took the folder, pretending to read it, and told him that his application was under review, but the probationary period would be strict. I kissed him, sealing the contract, and told him that he was hired. 6 months later, the glass walls of the Sterling Capital boardroom reflected a very different scene from the chaos of the past. Leo Miller, now wearing a custom-tailored suit that fit his small frame perfectly, sat at the head of the table, his feet barely touching the ground. The board members, a new group of hand-picked innovators and ethical investors, listened with rapt attention as the 5-year-old outlined the quarterly projection for their new cybersecurity division. Leo spoke with authority, his voice projecting clearly, explaining how their new algorithm would revolutionize data protection for hospitals and schools. He pointed to the screen, highlighting the profit margins, demonstrating a level of competence that silenced any doubt about his age. Standing behind his chair, slightly to the right, was Ethan Sterling. He was not wearing the CEO's power tie. He was wearing a simple, elegant suit, holding a tablet and a bottle of water for his boss. He watched Leo with a look of undisguised pride, nodding at the key points. acting as the advisor, the protector, and the silent strength behind the throne. When Leo finished his presentation, the room erupted in applause. Leo turned to Ethan, a small smile playing on his lips, and asked if he had missed anything. Ethan leaned down, whispering that it was perfect, and handed Leo his water. It was a reversal of roles that shocked the business world, but for us, it was the perfect balance. We left the office early that day, taking the private elevator down to the garage, but there were no paparazzi waiting, no scandals to fight. We drove to a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, the same one where I used to work, which Ethan had quietly bought and gifted to the old owner so he could retire. We sat at a corner table, eating pizza and drinking soda, laughing as Leo tried to explain quantum computing to Ethan using pepperoni slices. Ethan listened intently, asking questions, genuinely interested in his son's mind, not just his potential for profit. I looked at them, the two men of my life, one growing into his greatness and the other finding peace in his humility. Ethan caught my eye, reaching across the table to take my hand, his thumb tracing the ring he had put back on my finger a week ago. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said that he knew he was the luckiest man on earth. A man who had been given a second chance that he didn't deserve but would spend every day earning. Leo wiped tomato sauce from his chin and declared that next week he wanted to acquire a satellite company. Ethan laughed, a rich, genuine sound that filled the warm room, and said that he would draw up the paperwork, but only after Leo finished his vegetables. The night ended with a drive back to the penthouse, which had been stripped of its cold, museum-like quality and filled with Lego sets, half-read books, and family photos. We put Leo to bed, tucking him in under his galaxy-themed duvet, watching him drift off to sleep with the peace of a child who knows he is safe. Ethan and I stood on the balcony, looking out over the glittering skyline of New York City, the city that we had conquered, lost, and conquered again. The wind was cold, but I felt warm standing next to him, his arm wrapped around my waist. Ethan looked at the lights and said that for years. He thought he owned this city, but he was just a prisoner of it. He turned to me, pressing a kiss to my forehead, and said that now, with us, he was finally free. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of the heart that had almost stopped for us, and knew that the drama was over. We had survived the lies, the betrayal, the bullets, and the greed. We had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger, welded together by the heat of our trials. This was not just a happy ending, it was a new beginning. A story written not in ink or code, but in the enduring, unbreakable language of love.